In ancient Greece, if you wanted to be considered a true philosopher, your ultimate career goal wasn't exactly what you'd expect.
Right. It wasn't about publishing a best-selling scroll.
No, definitely not. And it wasn't about securing some, tenured position at the academy either.
Which is what we usually think of today.
Exactly. It was actually to die a good death.
Right.
The way you faced your final moments was like the ultimate proof of your life's work.
The final exam, basically.
Yeah, the final exam. And today, we spend billions of dollars on biohacking and cryogenics and all this crazy medical engineering just to live forever.
We really do. We treat mortality like it's a software glitch.
A glitch that we just haven't patched yet, right? So it really makes you wonder, what did the ancients know about facing the end that we have just completely forgotten?
Well, they understood that pretending the end doesn't exist actually makes the middle part of life much more terrifying.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, when we view death as a medical failure, we end up spending our entire lives running from an absolute inevitability. The classical world embraced a completely different paradigm.
Which was built around the concept of memento mori, right?
Exactly. Memento mori, the constant and very deliberate remembrance that you must die.
Which is the absolute core of our deep dive today. I am so thrilled you're joining us because we are unpacking the ultimate human question here.
How do we face the end of our lives?
Yes. And to do this, we are exploring Simon Critchley's The Book of Dead Philosophers.
It's quite a book.
It really is. So we're pulling from excerpts of the book itself, its massive table of contents, which catalogs, I think, roughly 190 thinkers.
There are almost 200 of them.
That's a lot of deaths to read about. And we're also using a comprehensive critical review that breaks down Critchley's methodology, his successes, and, well, his blind spots, too.
Because our overarching mission here is to examine Critchley's central argument. He basically proposes that philosophy at its absolute core is a preparation for death.
Which is a heavy claim.
It is. We want to find out if learning how these brilliant and frankly sometimes completely bizarre minds met their end can actually teach us something.
Teach us how to live more grounded, authentic lives today. Okay, let's unpack this. We live in a culture that just hides death away.
Oh. Completely behind closed doors.
You get sick, you go to a sterile hospital, the doctors come in and speak in these cold statistical probabilities.
And we just desperately try to postpone the inevitable for as long as possible.
Right. But Critchley opens his journey by quoting the Renaissance thinker Michel de Montaigne. He said, "He who would teach men to die would teach them to live."
A brilliant quote.
It is, but how does focusing on our own annihilation actually translate into everyday happiness for you and me?
Well, it sounds completely paradoxical, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the mechanism is actually quite practical. Think of it like you're carrying this heavy, invisible backpack of anxiety every single day of your life.
Okay, I'm trapping with you.
That anxiety is essentially the unacknowledged fear of death. So you try to ignore the backpack by accumulating wealth.
Or seeking status, or obsessing over your diet and health.
Exactly. But the weight is always there. So Montaigne, and Critchley by extension, are arguing that when you finally just take the backpack off and look inside, you accept the absolute reality of your mortality.
And then what happens?
The baseline terror of existence just kind of evaporates. You stop living for this hypothetical eternity, and you actually start living intensely in the present.
Stripping away the delusion to find actual peace.
Precisely.
And the blueprint for this entire mindset, it all traces back to the original philosophical death. I'm talking about Socrates.
Yes, the big one.
The man actually claimed that true philosophers make dying their profession. I can't imagine putting professional dyer on a modern resume.
I don't think HR would know what to do with that.
No, definitely not. But what did he actually mean by that in practice?
Well, Socrates lays this all out in two of Plato's really famous dialogues, the Apology and the Phaedo.
Right, when he's on trial.
Exactly. When Socrates is unjustly condemned to death by the Athenian court, he doesn't panic. He doesn't beg for his life or cry. Instead, he applies pure logic to the entire situation.
Which is such a flex, honestly.
It really is. He argues that death can only be one of two things. First, he says it might be a dreamless sleep.
Like an absolute annihilation of consciousness.
Right. Or second, it could be a migration of the soul to another realm where, you can converse with the great heroes and poets of the past.
Okay, so it's either infinite nothingness or you get into the VIP afterlife lounge.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And Socrates points out that if it is a dreamless sleep, There is zero reason to fear it.
Because a night of dreamless sleep is, it's one of the most peaceful experiences a human can have.
Exactly. And if it is a migration of the soul, what could possibly be a greater adventure than that?
That's true. But here is the mechanism that I think makes Socratic philosophy so unique. He admits that he actually does not know which one it is.
Yes, that is the crucial part. The defining trait of a philosopher is the willingness to tolerate absolute uncertainty.
Which completely shifts the goalposts. He isn't trying to sell you a map of the afterlife.
No, he's teaching a psychological posture. He's showing you how to stand firmly in the face of the unknown without flinching.
And that posture is just perfectly summarized by his final words. After he drinks the fatal hemlock poison, as his body is going numb, he turns to his friend.
And he says, Credo, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius.
I have always found that detail so incredibly strange. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing, right?
Yes, he was.
So why on earth would a dying man offer a sacrifice to a doctor god?
Well, because in ancient Greece, sick people would sleep in the temple of Asclepius. They were hoping the god would visit them in a dream and cure their illness.
Oh, I see.
By offering a rooster to the god of healing at the exact moment of his death, Socrates is making a profoundly radical philosophical statement.
He's saying that life itself is the illness.
Exactly. He is suggesting that biological life, with all of its suffering and ignorance and constant bodily demands, is the actual sickness.
Wow.
Death is the ultimate curative slumber. He is finally being healed.
That is a staggering way to frame it. But let me push back on this a little bit, just from the perspective of someone today trying to find actual comfort.
Sure, go ahead.
So Socrates was arguing against the sophists, right? These ancient teachers who charged massive fees to give people absolute certainty.
Yes, they were selling eloquent arguments and definitive answers.
Right. And Critchley compares those ancient sophists to modern televangelists or, New Age gurus selling enlightenment retreats in Malibu.
He does draw that parallel, yeah.
But is Critchley just being an academic snob here? Because millions of people find genuine comfort in modern palliative psychology, like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of grief.
Or spiritual texts.
Yeah, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And Critchley kind of just waves all this away as European Buddhism. Isn't it a bit elitist to say only the cold, uncertain Socratic death is valid?
That is a highly relevant critique, and honestly, it's one that many readers of Critchley's work bring up in the reviews.
Because it does feel a bit harsh.
It does. But if we dig into the underlying logic of Critchley's dismissal, it's not the comfort he objects to. It is the mechanism of that comfort.
What do you mean by the mechanism?
His issue with a lot of modern spiritual movements or even ancient esoteric texts is that they treat death as a puzzle to be solved or like an illusion to be transcended.
So they offer a sort of transactional system.
Exactly. They say if you meditate enough or if you buy the right seminar or achieve this specific state of consciousness, you can bypass the terror of death entirely.
They're selling a metaphysical loophole.
That's spot on. And Critchley argues that philosophy's duty is to deal with reality. And the reality is that death is a messy, physical, biological full stop.
It's not an illusion.
Right, it's not an illusion. When we try to strategize our way out of it through these complex spiritual systems, we're actually still just running away.
So true philosophy shouldn't offer a magical escape hatch.
No. It should build the psychological resilience to look the biological reality of annihilation right in the eye.
Which makes the stakes incredibly high. Because if philosophy is essentially a training ground for how to die, then a philosopher's lofty theories are meaningless if they just collapse into a screaming panic on their deathbed.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We need to know how these thinkers actually behaved when the Reaper showed up at their door.
Which leads us directly to the methodology of Critchley's book. He resurrects this ancient, almost forgotten genre of writing called doxography.
Yes, doxography.
It sounds incredibly dense, to be honest. What is the actual mechanism of a doxography?
Well, the term comes from the Greek word doxa, which means opinion or reputation. The most famous ancient doxographer was Diogenes Laertius back in the 3rd century AD.
Okay.
And doxography isn't just about recording a thinker's abstract logic. It is the cataloging of their daily habits, their physical ailments, their petty arguments.
It's a drama.
The drama, exactly. And most importantly, the specific, often very messy details of their deaths.
So it's essentially ancient philosophical paparazzi.
That's a great way to think about it.
Instead of just caring about the script the celebrity wrote, you want to see how they behave when the cameras are off and they're facing a real crisis.
Right.
But if this was the standard way of writing history, why did it disappear?
We can largely blame the 19th century German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel for that.
Oh, Hegel. Always complicating things.
Hegel popularized the idea that history is this massive rational engine. He called it the unfolding of the absolute spirit.
Right, so in Hegel's view, human history is constantly progressing toward these higher levels of freedom and rationality.
Exactly. So in that massive cosmic march of progress, the fact that a specific philosopher had a toothache or died of a cold is just completely irrelevant data to him.
It's just noise.
Exactly, noise. Hegel viewed the messy biological details of a philosopher's life as mere scaffolding. Once the philosophical idea was built, the scaffolding of the human body could just be discarded.
That's so clinical.
It is. And later philosophers like Martin Heidegger took this even further. Heidegger supposedly opened a lecture on Aristotle by saying he was born, he worked, and he died.
And then he just completely ignored Aristotle's biography.
Completely ignored it, moved right on to the concepts.
Wow. But Critchley is slamming the brakes on that Hegelian approach here.
He really is.
And for anyone listening who wonders why this academic debate actually matters to them, think about it this way. Have you ever taken advice from a self-help guru, only to find out their own personal life is a complete disaster?
It completely invalidates the advice, doesn't it?
It totally does. Critchley is arguing that we must look at the physical deaths of these geniuses to stress test their theories.
Right, you have to kick the tires.
Exactly. If your grand philosophy doesn't offer you genuine consolation when your own heart starts failing, then the philosophy is useless.
It recenters philosophy on the human body. Because philosophers are not just these disembodied brains floating in jars.
Right, they get indigestion, they slip on ice, they catch viruses like the rest of us.
And to prove this exact point, Critchley takes us on a chronological tour. He starts with the pre-Socratics, where the clash between abstract thought and physical reality is, honestly, often darkly comedic.
Oh, the deaths of these early physical philosophers are absolutely wild. They read less like history and more like ancient slapstick routines.
They really do.
Let's look at Thales. He's widely considered the very first Greek philosopher. His entire worldview was built on the idea that water is the foundational substance of the universe.
Yes, everything is moisture.
So how does the water philosopher die?
Well, according to the doxographers, he died of severe heat stroke and dehydration.
You're kidding?
No, he was sitting out in the scorching sun, watching an athletic contest. The man who theorized the universe was made of moisture literally dried out.
The irony is almost too perfect. Which kind of makes you wonder how much of this was dramatized by the writers later on.
Oh, there is definitely a myth-making element to these stories.
For sure. And then there's Heraclitus. He was famous for his misanthropy. He thought normal people were basically sleepwalking through reality.
So he retreated to the mountains to eat grass and herbs.
Right. But that terrible diet gave him a severe case of dropsy, which is an ancient term for edema, where the body dangerously retains fluid.
Yes. His body was swelling up.
So he comes down from the mountains demanding a cure.
And because he believed in this elemental philosophy where moisture was associated with a sluggish, bad soul and fire was associated with rationality, he decided he needed to draw the bad moisture out of his body.
Using fire?
Well, heat. He theorized that the heat of cow dung would act as a poultice to evaporate the moisture. So he ordered his servants to bury him up to his neck in a giant dung heap.
Which is just horrifying on a medical level alone. Did it work?
It failed catastrophically, though the historical accounts do differ on exactly how he died.
What are the options?
In one version, the dung was too wet, and the weeping philosopher essentially drowned or suffocated in it.
Oh my God.
In another, more common version, the dung dried out in the hot sun, forming this concrete-like shell, trapping him until he basically baked to death.
That is a nightmare.
And furthermore, being completely immobilized like that, he was supposedly eaten alive by a pack of wild dogs.
It's a grotesque consequence of taking a metaphor and applying it as a medical treatment.
It really is.
But even Heraclitus seems somewhat rational compared to Empedocles. This guy walked around in purple robes and bronze slippers, just claiming he was an immortal god.
He had quite the ego.
To put it mildly, he wanted to prove to his followers that death couldn't touch him, and that upon his disappearance he would ascend directly to the heavens.
So to prove this, he hiked up Mount Etna, which is a very active volcano in Sicily, and hurled himself into the molten caldera.
Just jumped right in.
Yes. He intended to vanish without a physical trace, thereby cementing his divine myth forever.
But the physical universe completely refused to cooperate with his branding strategy.
It did indeed.
The volcano eventually erupted and spat out one of his trademark bronze slippers, proving to all his followers that he was just a highly flammable, mortal man.
The volcano literally fact-checked him.
It did. These stories highlight the massive tension between doctrine and reality. But perhaps the most extreme example of prioritizing an abstract doctrine over physical survival is Pythagoras.
Yes, Pythagoras.
We all know the Pythagorean theorem from geometry class, but the man himself ran this highly secretive, cult-like community.
They were very intense. They were strict vegetarians who believed in the transmigration of souls.
But they had one hyper-specific, absolute taboo. They were forbidden from eating, touching, or even walking through a field of beans.
The fava beans. And the anthropological reasons for this bean taboo are actually still debated today.
Really? What are the theories?
Well, some scholars suggest the shape of the bean resembled human genitalia, linking them to reproduction and earthly attachment, which they wanted to avoid.
Okay, I guess that makes some kind of ancient sense.
Others point out that the hollow stems of the bean plant were thought to be conduits for the souls of the dead returning from the underworld.
Oh, that's spooky. But whatever the reason, the taboo was absolute.
It was unbreakable.
And it ultimately killed him. The doxographical legend is that Pythagoras and his followers were ambushed by a mob one night. They set fire to his meeting house.
So Pythagoras makes a run for it.
Right, he's sprinting away from these assassins, but his escape route forces him to confront a massive field of blooming fava beans.
And this is the ultimate test of his entire philosophy. Does he compromise his doctrine to save his biological life?
And he does not.
No, he doesn't. He stops at the edge of the field, turns around to face his pursuers, and declares that he would rather be slaughtered than trample a single bean.
And they just cut his throat on the spot.
They did.
It is an astonishing psychological commitment, and we see that same intense fanaticism in his followers, too. There's this horrific story about a pregnant Pythagorean woman named Timika.
Yes, that one is brutal.
She was captured by a tyrant who demanded to know the secret behind the bean taboo. He threatened her with medieval-level torture.
And rather than break her vow of silence and reveal the sex mysteries, Timika intentionally bites off her own tongue and spits it right into the tyrant's face.
The physical body is completely sacrificed to protect the abstract idea.
Completely.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, at least for me. It's when a philosopher's death entirely contradicts their life's work.
Ah, yes. Zeno.
Exactly. Zeno of Elea. His entire philosophical legacy is built on paradoxes designed to prove that motion is an illusion.
The famous paradox of Achilles and the tortoise.
Right. He argued that Achilles could never actually catch a tortoise in a race because the distance between them can be infinitely divided. For Zeno, the universe was a static, motionless block.
So how did the philosopher of ultimate stillness die?
He died in a state of absolute, violent, visceral motion.
He became involved in a political conspiracy to overthrow a local tyrant.
And the plot was discovered, of course. Zeno was captured and subjected to brutal interrogation. Refusing to name his co-conspirators, he tells the tyrant that he has a secret piece of information that he can only whisper directly into his ear.
And the tyrant, expecting a confession, leans in.
But Zeno bites down on the tyrant's ear, or in some historical accounts, his nose, with all his might.
He just locks his jaw.
He locks his jaw and refuses to let go, violently thrashing around until the tyrant's guards literally have to stab Zeno to death just to detach him.
It's wild. The man who theorized that motion didn't exist dies in a terrifying flurry of physical violence and torn flesh.
You just simply cannot separate the mind from the body when the stakes get that high.
You really can't. And as we move forward in history to the Hellenistic schools, specifically the Cynics, the Stoics, and the Epicureans, we see distinct strategies emerge for how to manage this vulnerability of the body.
Let's look at Diogenes the Cynic. This is the philosopher who famously lived in a ceramic tub in the marketplace, right?
Yes. And he walked around with a lantern in broad daylight looking for an honest man.
Such a character.
He was. Diogenes famously declared himself a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world. But Critchley is very careful to point out that this was not some warm, inclusive internationalism like we think of today.
What was it then?
It was a radical, anti-political rejection of all civic duties, laws, and social norms. The Cynics believed that society was fundamentally corrupt.
So the only way to live authentically was to live like a dog.
Exactly, which is literally where the word cynic comes from, the Greek word for dog.
He used his physical body to mock power structures. I mean, the most famous anecdote is when Alexander the Great, the most powerful conqueror on Earth, approaches Diogenes, who is just sunbathing.
Alexander asks if there is any boon or favor he can grant the philosopher.
And Diogenes just looks at him and says, yes, stand a little out of my sun.
It's brilliant.
He completely strips Alexander of his power just by genuinely not caring about it. And when Diogenes is dying, he is asked how he wants his body disposed of.
And his answer is perfectly in character.
He says, throw me outside the city walls so the wild animals can feast. And when his friends are horrified and say that's terrible, he says, well, then give me a stick so I can chase them away.
And they point out he'll be dead and won't be able to use the stick.
Right. And Diogenes replies, if I lack awareness, why should I care what happens to my body?
That intense lightness, that absolute refusal to take the physical destruction of the body seriously at all, is a hallmark of that era.
It really is. Now, the Stoics approach it with a slightly different mechanism, right?
Yes. For the Stoic, the ultimate goal is cosmic calm, which is known as apatheia.
Apatheia.
They believed that the universe was governed by a rational divine order, the macrocosm. The individual human mind is just a tiny spark of that divine reason, the microcosm.
Okay, I follow.
Therefore, death is not actually an ending. It is simply the microcosm dissolving back into the macrocosm.
So there's no reason to panic, because you're just returning to the source code of the universe.
Exactly. And because of this cosmic logic, the Stoics exercise supreme, almost frightening control over their own deaths.
Like Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism.
Yes, Zeno reportedly tripped, broke his toe, struck the ground with his hand, and quoted a line of poetry saying, I come, why do you call me?
And then what?
And then he simply held his breath until he died. He decided his time was up, and his body complied.
That is an insane level of autonomic control. I didn't even think that was biologically possible.
It's definitely borderline mythic. But his successor, Cleanthes, was equally rigid. Cleanthes developed a severe gum infection, and his doctor ordered him to fast for a few days to clear it up.
Okay, pretty standard medical advice.
After the infection cleared, the doctor said he could resume eating normally. But Cleanthes had found the fasting to be quite peaceful.
Oh, no.
He told the doctor that since he was already a few days down the road toward death, it would be a real shame to turn back and have to make the journey all over again later.
So he just didn't eat?
He just continued starving himself in perfect tranquility until he passed away.
It's impressive, but it's also, it's a little terrifying. It feels so detached from human instinct, although not all Stoics were so grim.
That's true.
Chrysippus, another major Stoic thinker, literally died of laughter.
A much better way to go.
Right. He saw a donkey eating his prized figs, told a servant to give the donkey some fine wine to wash it down, and he found his own joke so incredibly funny that he fell into a fit of laughter and suffered a fatal cardiac event.
It's the ultimate image of philosophical equanimity tipping right over into fatal comedy.
Absolutely. But if the Stoics sought peace by merging with a divine cosmic order, the Epicureans sought peace through absolute materialism.
Yes, Epicurus is fascinating here. He developed a philosophy based entirely on the physics of atoms.
Atoms, like ancient physics.
Yes. He argued that the human soul is not some eternal divine spark like the Stoics thought. It is just a temporary cluster of highly mobile atoms.
Okay.
When your biological body dies, the structure holding those atoms together dissolves, and the atoms simply disperse back into the void.
So, mechanically, if the soul just disperses, there is no consciousness left over to be, tortured by Hades or judged by the gods.
Precisely. This atomic theory led to his famous four-part cure for human anxiety.
Which was?
Do not fear the gods, do not worry about death, what is good is easy to obtain, and what is terrible is easy to endure.
Wait, don't worry about death isn't a mechanical cure, it's just telling someone to calm down.
Yeah.
How did he actually convince his followers to stop worrying? What was the logical mechanism there?
The logic is elegantly simple, actually. It's summarized in his maxim. Death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not yet present.
Okay.
And when death is present, then we do not exist.
Oh, I see.
It is logically impossible for you and death to be in the same room at the same time. You cannot experience death because experience requires consciousness, and death is the end of consciousness.
Okay, let me put myself in that headspace for a second. If I think about the year 1800, I'm not panicking that I missed it. I wasn't missing out. I just wasn't. I had no consciousness. So his Roman follower, Lucretius, uses the exact same logic for the future.
Yes, Lucretius's symmetry argument.
It essentially says, if the eternity of non-existence before you were born didn't cause you any pain, Why on earth are you terrified of the eternity of non-existence after you die?
It's the exact same state.
It's the symmetry of non-existence. But think about how hard that is for the modern ego to accept. We live in a culture driven by the fear of missing out.
Huge FOMO.
Huge. If I die, I miss the next massive technological breakthrough. I miss my children growing up. I miss the future of humanity.
And Epicurus would counter that FOMO by reminding you that missing out requires an active subject to feel the loss.
Right. Someone has to be there to be sad.
Exactly. Once the atoms disperse, there is no you left to feel deprived. You won't be sitting in a dark void lamenting what you're missing. You simply won't be.
That is so stark, but strangely comforting.
And Epicurus was so confident in this materialist piece that he actually proved it on his deathbed. He died from kidney stones.
Which, in the ancient world without painkillers, had to be an agonizing, prolonged way to die.
It was horrific. Yet, on his last day, he wrote a letter to a friend, stating that the severe physical agony was entirely counterbalanced by the mental joy he felt, recalling his philosophical discoveries.
He practically hacked his own nervous system using logic.
He really did.
And it works brilliantly for curing the fear of your own death. But here is the massive, gaping flaw in the Epicurean logic. It completely fails to address the aspect of death that is actually the most devastating.
Yes. The symmetry argument completely collapses when it comes to grief.
It offers absolutely zero comfort when the person who dies is someone you love.
None at all.
Right, because it's one thing to say my own non-existence is fine because I won't be around to care, but when my spouse dies or my child, they are gone, and I am still here.
You are left behind.
The atoms dispersed, sure, but I am left carrying this agonizing, unbearable absence. Where did philosophers turn when cold atomic logic failed the human heart?
This is one of the most profound sections of Critchley's analysis, I think. He argues that mourning fundamentally unstitches the carefully tailored suit of our identity.
It just pulls us apart.
But crucially, he suggests that we are actually constituted by our grief. We are shaped by the absences we carry. To be human is to be attached, and to be attached is to eventually suffer loss.
It's like grief is the negative space that defines the sculpture of who we are.
That's a beautiful metaphor, yes.
But if grief is that central, it implies we can never achieve that perfect, detached philosophical calm as long as we love anyone.
It's the cost of admission. Look at St. Augustine. He is a towering intellect of early Christianity, but in his Confessions, he writes with shattering vulnerability about the death of his mother, Monica.
And later his teenage son, Diogenes, right?
Yes. Augustine's reaction provides a really deep look into the psychology of religious grief. He experiences what Critchley terms a twofold sadness.
What does that mean, twofold?
Well, on one level, he is utterly devastated by the physical absence of his mother. But as a devout Christian theologian, he believes with absolute certainty that she is in heaven with God.
Right, so according to his own theology, he should be rejoicing.
Exactly. Therefore, his intense grief induces a secondary layer of intense guilt.
Oh, wow. He is grieving the fact that he is grieving.
He really is. For Augustine, his uncontrollable tears are evidence of his own sinful imperfection.
Because it shows he's not fully trusting God.
Yes, they prove that he is still deeply attached to human flesh and blood relationships, rather than being completely, perfectly surrendered to the will of God. His grief becomes a theological failure.
But wait, if attachment to people causes this agonizing twofold suffering when they die, is the philosophical goal to detach completely? Like, does philosophy just want us to be emotionally numb?
It's a valid question.
Because avoiding love just to avoid grief sounds like a terrible way to live.
That is the eternal friction of philosophy. And to address this, Critchley intentionally looks outside the Western canon to see how Eastern philosophers handled this exact same friction.
I'm glad he included that.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, by bringing in classical Chinese thinkers, he breaks the Eurocentric bubble and proves that navigating the devastation of grief is a universal human project.
Not just a Greek or Roman one.
Right. And the response from the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi offers a radical alternative to both Stoic numbness and Augustinian guilt.
Zhuangzi's approach is mind-bending. He doesn't try to defeat death with logic or transcend it with theology at all.
No, he frames death as a natural, inevitable transformation.
He says it's as mundane and predictable as the progression of the four seasons. Spring turns to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter.
And to panic over winter is to misunderstand how the weather works.
Exactly. So to panic over death is to misunderstand how the universe works.
And the mechanism of this acceptance is beautifully illustrated in the famous story of his wife's death.
I love this story.
When Zhuangzi's wife passed away, his closest friend, Rishi, came to offer his condolences. By all societal standards, he expected to find Zhuangzi weeping, fasting, and sitting in ashes.
A proper mourning period.
Right. Instead, he walks in and finds Zhuangzi sitting with his legs sprawled out in a deeply informal posture, pounding rhythmically on a tub and singing at the top of his lungs.
Which, to modern ears, and certainly to his friend's ears back then, sounds completely unhinged. The friend actually scolds him.
He does.
He says, "She lived with you, raised your children, and grew old with you. Not weeping is disrespectful enough, but singing and drumming, you've lost your mind."
But Zhuangzi calmly explains the mechanics of his behavior. He admits that when she first died, he did grieve.
Right.
He felt the biological shock of loss.
He didn't just bypass the human emotion.
No, he felt it. But then he applied his philosophy. He traced her existence backward. He looked back to the time before she was born, before she had a physical body, before she even had a spirit.
Back to the formless.
Yes. She emerged from a formless, mysterious state into the physical world. Now, through another natural mechanism of change, she has died.
She hasn't been annihilated.
No, she has simply moved on to the next phase of the great cosmic transformation, returning to the formless.
So he argues that to follow her physical body, bawling and sobbing, would be like crying because spring turned into summer. It would show that he arrogantly thought he could pause the universe.
Exactly.
Imagine applying that today. Imagine a modern funeral where the widower starts drumming and singing in celebration of the universe's recycling program. We'd think he needed a psychiatric hold.
People would definitely call someone.
But Zhuangzi is challenging us to ask, is our modern prolonged mourning actually just a selfish, ego-driven refusal to accept the natural cycles of reality?
It is a radical decentering of the human ego. Zhuangzi truly believed in the absolute equality of all physical forms. A human body is no more precious to the universe than a clod of dirt or a bird.
And he maintained this humor and acceptance right up to his own death, right?
He did. When he was dying, his disciples were panicked about how to bury him. They wanted to build a massive, elaborate tomb to protect his body from scavengers.
They were terrified that crows and eagles would eat his corpse.
And Zhuangzi's response is the ultimate mic drop on human vanity. He points out the basic biological reality of decomposition. He says, if you leave me above ground, I'll be eaten by crows and eagles.
Right.
If you bury me deep in the ground, I'll be eaten by ants. You're snatching food from the mouths of the crows just to feed it to the ants. Why are you showing such blatant favoritism to the ants?
Ant food versus crow food. In the grand scheme of the Tao, it is all perfectly equal.
It is dust to dust, delivered with a wry smile.
But as beautiful and peaceful as that natural acceptance is in theory, the historical reality is that philosophers rarely got to choose a peaceful fade into nature.
That is very true.
If the Greeks and the Chinese figured out how to die gracefully in a theoretical vacuum, what happens when a dictator literally puts a sword to your neck?
It's a completely different test.
As we look at the Roman era, the philosophy collides violently with political tyranny. Does the philosophy survive the politics?
In Rome, philosophy was not just an academic pursuit. It was highly dangerously political. And under tyrannical emperors, a philosopher's death was often a public, mandated spectacle.
The ideals of Stoic calm were brutally tested.
Very brutally. Take Cicero, the brilliant statesman, orator, and philosopher. He uses his eloquence to defend the Roman Republic against the rising tyranny of Mark Antony.
And it costs him everything. He isn't given the dignity of drinking hemlock among friends like Socrates.
No, he is hunted down by Antony's soldiers. He is butchered.
And in a horrific display of political terror, Antony orders that Cicero's head and his hands, the very instruments he used to write and deliver his philosophical speeches, be chopped off and nailed to the rostra in the Roman Forum.
It's a message that brute force will always silence abstract philosophy.
And the betrayal goes even deeper than that. Cicero was sold out to the assassins by a youth named Philologus, whom Cicero had personally educated and treated like family.
And the revenge for that betrayal is incredibly dark.
When Cicero's sister-in-law captured Philologus, the punishment she devised was grotesque. She forced the betrayer to slowly cut off pieces of his own flesh, roast them over a fire, and eat them.
A forced, self-service barbecue. It completely strips away the romanticized noble death and exposes the raw, terrifying violence of human nature that philosophy so often tries to gloss over.
It really does.
We see a different, but equally challenging collision of philosophy and politics with Seneca.
Right, Seneca.
Seneca was a master of Stoic philosophy. He wrote extensive, beautiful treatises on how to face death with perfect tranquility, but he also served as the primary advisor to the Emperor Nero,
who was one of history's most notoriously unstable tyrants. Talk about a conflict of interest. The philosopher of calm advising the emperor of chaos.
Exactly. Eventually, Nero's paranoia turns on Seneca, and he orders his old tutor to commit suicide.
So what does Seneca do?
Seneca attempts to stage a textbook, Noble Stoic Death. He gathers his friends, offers them profound final words, and calmly slits his wrists.
But the biological reality refuses to cooperate with the philosophical script. Seneca is old, his diet has been incredibly frugal, his circulation is too weak, and he simply doesn't bleed fast enough.
The grand theatrical exit turns into a clumsy, agonizing ordeal.
So he pivots. He asks his doctor for hemlock, explicitly trying to mirror the death of Socrates. He drinks the poison, but again, his weak circulation means the poison fails to reach his heart.
The great Stoic philosopher is reduced to desperately trying to force his failing body to expire.
It's awful. Finally, they carry him into a hot vapor bath, hoping the steam will accelerate the bleeding, and he ends up basically suffocating in the steam.
The messy biology completely undermines the Stoic aesthetics. Now, contrast Seneca's botched, serious attempt with Petronius.
Okay, what did Petronius do?
Petronius was known as Nero's arbiter of elegance. He was a satirist and a cynic. When Nero inevitably orders him to commit suicide as well, Petronius decides to make a total mockery of the solemn Socratic death tradition.
He stages what Critchley calls an anti-philosophical death, right?
Yes. Petronius slits his wrists, but then he has his doctor bind them up with bandages.
Why?
Because he doesn't want to die quickly. He wants to throw a party.
He literally hangs out. He dines with his friends. He chats about light poetry. He rewards his favorite slaves with money and orders the incompetent ones to be flogged. He takes naps.
He treats his execution like a long, drawn-out, highly curated dinner party before finally taking the bandages off, letting himself bleed out, and drifting off.
It's a brilliant refusal to give the emperor the satisfaction of seeing him suffer, but it's also a refusal to pretend that dying is some holy, solemn duty.
Petronius used his death as a final act of satire. But that entire classical paradigm, whether it's Stoic calm, Epicurean detachment, or cynical satire, gets completely upended by a massive historical shift.
Right, the rise of Christianity completely overwrites the mechanics of how we approach death.
Entirely. For the pagans, death was a natural process, a recycling of atoms or a return to the cosmic mind. But with figures like St. Paul, death is no longer natural.
Paul argues that death was not part of the original design, right?
Exactly. Death is a glitch introduced by human sin. Death entered the world through Adam's fall, and it operates as a punishment.
That fundamentally shifts the psychological paradigm. Death is no longer something to be faced with calm equanimity. It becomes a terrifying threshold.
Because of Christ's resurrection, the Christian philosopher believes death can be defeated, but only through divine grace. Therefore, the art of dying becomes a high-stakes, anxiety-ridden rehearsal for eternal judgment.
You approach the end with fear and trembling because your eternal soul is on the line.
The body goes from being a neutral vessel to a site of intense spiritual warfare. We see early Christian thinkers like Origen reportedly castrating himself to eliminate the temptations of the flesh.
Viewing the body as an enemy to be disciplined, and he eventually died from the injuries of torture and prison, right?
Yes. As we move into the Middle Ages, Christian theology attempts to synthesize with the rediscovered texts of Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle.
But the deaths of these great medieval synthesizers remain deeply unpredictable and often shockingly undignified.
Which proves Critchley's point that no amount of grand theology makes you immune to a bizarre exit.
Take John Scotus Erigena. He's a brilliant 9th century Irish philosopher. He translates massive Greek theological works. How does he die?
Well, the doxographical legend is that he was stabbed to death by his own students using their metal writing pens.
It's a rather dark, literal manifestation of the phrase publish or perish, highlighting the often vicious nature of academic disputes.
It is. Or look at Avicenna. He was arguably the greatest Islamic physician and philosopher of his time.
He literally wrote the Canon of Medicine, which was the standard medical text in Europe and the Islamic world for centuries. You'd assume the greatest medical mind alive would manage a smooth, highly controlled exit.
Instead, his death sounds incredibly chaotic. The historical accounts suggest he suffered from severe colic, exacerbated by a lifestyle of intense intellectual labor paired with extreme sexual hedonism.
In an attempt to cure his intestinal pain, he ordered his assistants to administer 8 enemas in a single day,
which severely ulcerated his intestines.
The doctor essentially overdosed himself on ancient medical procedures.
And to top it all off, a servant allegedly poisoned him with too much opium in an attempt to rob him while he was incapacitated.
The master of medicine is undone by his own bodily appetites and medical hubris.
We see a different kind of hubris humbled in the life of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas is the towering intellectual architect of the Middle Ages.
He wrote millions of words. His Summa Theologica is this massive, systematic attempt to explain absolutely everything about God, the universe, and ethics using Aristotelian logic.
But near the end of his life, this unstoppable writing machine just abruptly stops.
While celebrating Mass, he has a profound, inexplicable, mystical experience. Afterward, he just refuses to dictate another word.
When his secretary begs him to continue his masterwork, Aquinas simply says, "I can do no more. Such secrets have been revealed to me that all I have written now appears to be of little value."
Or in the famous translation, it all seemed like straw.
The great architect of logic realizes that divine reality completely eclipses human language. All his millions of words were just dry straw compared to the actual fire of existence.
And the physical conclusion to his life is equally humbling. A few months later, he is riding a donkey on his way to a church council. He isn't paying attention, and he accidentally smashes his head into the low-hanging branch of a tree.
The trauma from that blow eventually kills him.
It's intensely symbolic. The man who tried to map the mind of God is fatally concussed by a piece of wood.
But for my money, the most ironic death of the medieval period belongs to William Occam.
The pioneer of nominalism and the inventor of Occam's razor.
Right. The principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one.
Occam's razor cuts away all the unnecessary, bloated metaphysical assumptions to find the stark empirical truth based purely on logic and evidence.
And how does the great champion of logic die? He dies in the outbreak of the Black Death.
The bubonic plague.
Yes. It is the ultimate triumph of biology over intellect. No amount of logical analysis, no rigorous theological debate could explain or negotiate with the plague bacteria.
It is a visceral, terrifying reminder of human creatureliness. A microscopic organism simply bypassed all of humanity's grandest philosophical defenses.
And that trauma of the plague, combined with the Renaissance's rediscovery of classical texts, initiates the next massive paradigm shift.
Right, the unquestioned religious safety net that defined the Middle Ages begins to fray.
The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment start to push God to the margins. Philosophers are once again forced to figure out how to face the abyss without the absolute comforting guarantee of a heavenly reward.
We see this transition beautifully in figures like Thomas More, the author of Utopia. He is a devout Catholic who refuses to acknowledge King Henry VIII as the supreme head of the church.
He knows this means execution for treason.
But he faces his beheading with a calm wit that directly echoes Socrates. As he approaches the execution block, the wooden scaffold is incredibly rickety and shaking.
And he turns to the lieutenant and says, "I pray you, Master Lieutenant, see me safe up, and for my coming down, let me shift for myself."
He delivers a dad joke on his way to the chopping block. It demonstrates an incredible psychological mastery over fear.
It really does. But the philosopher who truly cracks the code on the psychology of dying in this era is Michel de Montaigne.
Montaigne spent years obsessing over death, writing essays trying to mentally prepare himself for it. But then he actually experiences it physically.
He is out riding his horse, and one of his servants, riding at a full gallop, loses control and crashes directly into Montaigne.
Montaigne is violently thrown from the saddle. He's coughing up massive amounts of blood. His skin is cold. He's slipping in and out of consciousness. Everyone around him assumes he is taking his final breaths.
But Montaigne survives, and when he recovers, he writes about the experience. The crucial revelation he has is that the actual process of slipping away, the physical mechanism of dying, was not terrifying at all.
It felt peaceful to him, like drifting into a deep, gentle sleep.
He realizes that the fear of death, which he had cultivated in his mind for years, was infinitely more painful than the physical act of dying.
The anxiety was the real enemy, not the mortality.
That realization is incredibly liberating. It suggests that our anticipation creates our suffering. But as the scientific revolution kicks into high gear, we see philosophers pushing their inquiries into nature, with a zeal that ultimately kills them.
We could call it death by empiricism. Look at Francis Bacon.
The father of the scientific method. He believed that knowledge isn't just contemplation. Knowledge is power over nature.
But nature bites back. Bacon is riding in a carriage through the snow outside London. He gets a sudden empirical idea about whether extreme cold could preserve flesh.
Instead of writing a hypothesis and testing it in a controlled environment later, he jumps out of the carriage, buys a freshly slaughtered chicken from a local woman, and starts physically packing the bird's carcass with freezing snow with his bare hands.
He catches a severe chill, gets put into a damp bed at a nearby estate, and promptly dies of pneumonia. The man who wanted to conquer nature is killed by a winter breeze and a frozen chicken.
René Descartes meets a strikingly similar, biologically humbling fate, though driven by a different kind of obligation.
Descartes, the man who famously said, "I think, therefore I am," he built his entire philosophy on dualism.
The strict separation between the eternal, rational mind and the mechanical, physical body. He viewed the body as essentially a complex clockwork machine that the mind operates.
But his clockwork machine was notoriously fragile. He is lured to Stockholm by Queen Christina of Sweden to serve as her personal philosophy tutor.
But the queen demands that her lessons take place at 5 a.m. in the freezing, drafty Swedish castle during the dead of winter.
Descartes, who usually stayed in a warm bed until noon, discovers that his physical machine simply cannot handle the environmental stress. He catches a viral respiratory infection and dies of pneumonia.
It's a stark reminder that no matter how elegantly you separate the mind from the body in theory, when the body's temperature drops too low, the mind is dragged down with it.
Which forces the Enlightenment era to confront a massive looming question, one that Critchley calls the atheist's test.
Ah, yes, the atheist's test.
If the scientific revolution reduces the universe to mechanical laws and the soul is just brain function, can a strict atheist die well? Without the promise of an afterlife to soothe the ego, do you inevitably fall into despair when the end approaches?
Baruch Spinoza is the first major test case. He argued that God and nature are not separate. They are the exact same thing.
There's no personal God sitting on a throne judging your sins. There are just the eternal mathematical laws of nature. To understand nature is to understand God.
Because of this view, Spinoza was excommunicated and cursed by his Jewish community in Amsterdam and reviled as a dangerous atheist by Christians.
Yet his personal life was impeccably ethical. He lived quietly, supporting himself by grinding optical lenses. And when he died of a lung illness, likely exacerbated by inhaling glass dust from his work, he died peacefully in his rented room while his neighbors were at church.
He proved that a life of deep, rational ethics doesn't require a fear of hell, and a peaceful death doesn't require a priest.
But David Hume takes the atheist test and turns it into a masterclass.
Hume was known as the Great Infidel because he ruthlessly dismantled the logical arguments for miracles and the afterlife. When Hume was dying of bowel cancer in Edinburgh, his deeply religious friends were watching him closely.
Specifically, James Boswell, a devout Christian. Boswell secretly hoped to witness the atheist's facade crumble. He expected Hume to be terrified of impending annihilation, hoping for a dramatic deathbed conversion.
But Hume completely disappointed him.
Hume was incredibly cheerful. While his body was wasting away, he was joking with his friends about trying to negotiate a delay with Charon, the mythological ferryman of the underworld.
Boswell, point blank, asks Hume if the thought of total annihilation terrifies him.
And Hume calmly replies that it terrifies him no more than the thought that he had not existed before he was born. He deploys the exact Epicurean symmetry argument we discussed earlier.
Boswell leaves the interview deeply shaken and horrified, unable to comprehend how a man could face absolute oblivion without a flicker of panic.
Hume has the test with flying colors. It proves that the Enlightenment ideal facing reality purely with reason and good humor actually works. But let's be real, they didn't all die with such quiet dignity.
No, some Enlightenment deaths were just brutally absurd. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher who championed the inherent goodness of nature and the social contract, grew incredibly paranoid in his later years.
He is taking a peaceful walk in Paris, and he gets absolutely flattened by a massive Great Dane running at full speed.
The impact was so severe it caused a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and he died a couple of years later, likely from the lingering neurological effects of that collision.
And Denis Diderot, the great encyclopedist and staunch materialist, basically choked to death on an apricot. He is finishing dinner, reaches for the fruit, and his wife warns him that it might upset his stomach.
Diderot's final words are essentially, "What the devil kind of harm do you expect it to do to me?" He takes a bite, chokes, and dies.
It is the ultimate materialist punchline, a stubborn refusal to take death seriously, right up to the very last bite.
So what does this all mean? We must also note that this strict materialism began pushing the boundaries of medical ethics. Thinkers like Lamettrie, who ironically died of a severe fever after gorging himself on truffle pate, and Radicati began arguing for the absolute right to suicide.
Which makes logical sense if you're a strict materialist. If the body is just a machine made of atoms and the machine is in unbearable, unfixable pain, why shouldn't the owner have the right to turn it off?
There's no God to punish you for destroying his property. It's a debate that lays the groundwork for our modern arguments over bodily autonomy and euthanasia.
But the sunny optimism of the Enlightenment, the belief that reason, science, and a good sense of humor could conquer all human anxieties, does not survive the transition into the modern era.
As we move into the 19th and 20th centuries, that bright confidence fractures into heavy, suffocating pessimism and unprecedented historical trauma.
The era of systemic logic peaks with Immanuel Kant. Kant was obsessed with duty and categorical imperatives. He lived a life of such rigidly structured routine in Königsberg that the locals supposedly set their clocks by his daily afternoon walk.
His life was a perfectly ordered machine. When his mind and body finally broke down in extreme old age, his final word before dying was simply sufficit, which means it is enough.
But that orderly, rational end is immediately countered by the emergence of what philosopher Paul Ricoeur called the masters of suspicion. Thinkers who looked beneath the surface of logic and found dark, irrational drives. Enter Arthur Schopenhauer,
the godfather of philosophical pessimism. Schopenhauer argued that the core reality of the universe isn't a rational, loving God, nor is it a neat mathematical equation. It's a blind, striving, ravenous force that he called the will.
For Schopenhauer, human consciousness is a tragic accident. Life is just a constant swing between the pain of wanting something and the boredom of getting it. He literally wrote that life is an expiation for the crime of being born.
He theorized that the only way to find peace was to completely deny the will, to embrace extreme asceticism, starvation, and aesthetic detachment. But the glaring hypocrisy of Schopenhauer is that his personal life looked nothing like his philosophy.
Right. He wrote about the nobility of starving monks, but he lived a very comfortable bourgeois life. He loved good food, he played the flute, and he was famously petty and cruel.
He had a noise phobia, and one day a seamstress was chatting with a friend in the hallway outside his door. Schopenhauer became so enraged by the noise that he physically attacked her and threw her down the stairs.
The injuries she sustained were severe enough that a court ordered the philosopher to pay her a monthly pension for the rest of her life. Decades later, when the seamstress finally died, Schopenhauer cold-bloodedly wrote on a copy of her death certificate, "The old woman dies, the burden is lifted."
It's a staggering display of viciousness from a man who wrote volumes on the necessity of compassion and the denial of the ego. It proves that possessing a brilliant philosophy of suffering doesn't prevent you from being the cause of it.
And if Schopenhauer shows the moral failure of 19th century philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche demonstrates its psychological collapse. Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God and urged humanity to embrace the Übermensch, the Superman who creates his own values and affirms life in all its brutal reality.
But the philosopher of ultimate strength suffers a devastating breakdown. He's in Turin, Italy, and he sees a cab driver viciously whipping a horse in the street.
The man who wrote that pity was a weakness, runs over, throws his arms around the bleeding horse's neck, weeping, and his mind simply snaps. He spends the last 11 years of his life in a catatonic, demented state, completely reliant on his mother and sister. The prophet of the Superman ends his life entirely stripped of reason and power.
And we shouldn't forget Hegel, who we discussed earlier as the architect of historical progress. He died suddenly in a cholera epidemic. His alleged last words were a tragicomic testament to the isolation of genius. Only one man ever understood me, and he didn't understand me.
But all of these personal individual tragedies get completely swallowed up by the massive mechanized horrors of the 20th century. The world wars changed everything. We aren't just debating abstract theories of mortality in a university courtyard anymore. Philosophy is now trying to operate in a world of trenches, gas chambers, and state-sponsored genocide.
The historical context infuses the philosophy of death with an unbearable ethical weight. Look at the life and death of Simone Weil. She was a brilliant French mystic and philosopher. During the Second World War, she escaped to safety in England, but she was so consumed by the suffering of her compatriots in occupied France that she refused to eat more than the meager rations allocated to them under Nazi rule.
Even though food was available to her in London, she essentially starved herself to death out of absolute ascetic solidarity.
Or consider Edith Stein. She was a brilliant Jewish-born philosopher and phenomenologist who converted to Catholicism and became a Carmelite nun. Despite her cloistered life, the Nazi regime hunted her down based on her heritage, and she was murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz.
And Henri Bergson, arguably the most famous French philosopher of his time, the Vichy government, collaborating with the Nazis, actually offered Bergson an exemption from the anti-Semitic laws because of his international fame.
But Bergson refused the privilege. He stood in line for hours in the freezing cold to register as a Jew in solidarity with the persecuted. The exposure gave him a fatal respiratory infection, and he died. For these thinkers, philosophy wasn't a text, it was flesh, blood, and profound ethical action.
Against this backdrop of mass slaughter and existential dread, Martin Heidegger publishes his masterpiece, Being and Time. Heidegger proposes that the absolute defining characteristic of a human being is what he calls being towards death.
What is the actual mechanism of being towards death? How does that change how a person lives on a Tuesday?
Think of it like being on a vacation. If you delusionally believe the vacation will last forever, you waste days sitting in the hotel room watching TV. But if you acutely realize that your flight leaves on Sunday, suddenly Friday afternoon becomes intensely valuable.
Heidegger argues that our mortality is the only thing that gives our lives structure and urgency. To live authentically, you must constantly project your life against the horizon of your own inevitable death. You must make your death your own individualized project.
Framing it like that sounds incredibly empowering. It cuts through the superficial distractions. But Critchley, leaning heavily on the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, launches a fierce critique of Heidegger's view. If taking ownership of my own timeline makes me authentic, what is the flaw in that logic?
Levinas argues that Heidegger's philosophy is fundamentally narcissistic. It makes death a purely solitary, ego-driven project. Think about that vacation analogy again. What if, on that vacation, your partner gets hit by a car? Suddenly, your own timeline, your own authentic project doesn't matter at all. Your entire world is shattered by the loss of the other.
Oh, wow. So Levinas is saying Heidegger completely missed the point of human connection.
Exactly. Levinas and Critchley argue that we do not primarily experience death through our own demise. We experience it through the devastating ethical weight of the death of the other person, the parent, the partner, or even the unknown victim of a war. Our primary relationship to mortality is relational and ethical, not solitary. By obsessing over our own being towards death, we ignore our profound responsibility to the dying other.
That is a staggering critique, and this intense focus on lived experience highlights the famous divide in 20th century philosophy. The continental philosophers versus the analytic philosophers. The continentals are the French and German thinkers, people like Heidegger, Sartre, Foucault, who focus on existentialism, power, and phenomenology. The analytics dominate the British and American universities, focusing strictly on logic, language, and the philosophy of science. Critchley clearly plays favorites here, doesn't he?
He does. He critiques the analytic tradition, suggesting that analytic philosophers largely led successful, highly professionalized bourgeois lives and consequently died incredibly boring, undramatic deaths. In his view, analytic philosophy became a dry academic job, divorced from the messy existential business of living and dying.
Whereas the continentals lived and died at the extreme bleeding edge of their ideas. Jean-Paul Sartre, the quintessential existentialist who claimed death had no place in his philosophy of absolute freedom, died blind, physically devastated by decades of chain-smoking, drinking, and amphetamine abuse, with 50,000 people surging through the streets of Paris for his funeral.
Michel Foucault, the theorist of power and biopolitics, died of AIDS in the early days of the epidemic. But he approached his death intentionally, supposedly reading Seneca's letters on death in his final days, essentially trying to turn his tragic end into a classical work of art.
And Gilles Deleuze, suffocating from severe emphysema strapped to oxygen machines, simply refused to let his failing body dictate his end. He threw himself out of the window of his Paris apartment.
The Continentals certainly provided the dramatic doxography Critchley favors. However, Critchley's dismissal of the analytic philosophers isn't entirely fair, and he does concede there is one glorious, completely bizarre exception: the British philosopher A.J. Ayer.
Freddie Ayer. He is the poster child for strict, uncompromising logic. He wrote Language, Truth, and Logic, arguing that any statement about God, metaphysics, or the afterlife wasn't just wrong, it was literally meaningless nonsense because it couldn't be empirically verified. But then, Late in his life, the ultimate logician has a medical emergency. He is in the hospital eating smoked salmon and he chokes. His heart stops. The monitors flatline. For 4 minutes, the great atheist is clinically dead.
And when the doctors finally manage to resuscitate him, Ayer reports a near-death experience that completely shatters his strict logical framework.
It is the ultimate cosmic glitch. Ayer reports that he saw a blindingly bright red light that seemed to govern the universe. He encountered what he called the ministers of space, who had apparently done a shoddy job causing space to be slightly out of joint. He saw the ministers of time further off, and remembering Einstein's theory of relativity, he actually tries to wave his pocket watch at them to get their attention and fix the spatial glitch.
It is a surreal, almost Lewis Carroll-esque vision.
The man who spent his life destroying metaphysics is waving a watch at the ministers of time. Ayer later wrote an article titled "What I Saw When I Was Dead," where he admitted the experience provided some evidence that death might not put an end to consciousness.
It brilliantly illustrates Critchley's point. You can build the most rigorous, airtight logical fortress in the world, but the visceral, physiological reality of standing on the threshold of death has the power to crack it wide open.
So, having taken this wild, centuries-long chronological tour of philosophical deaths, we have to step back and evaluate the book itself. When Critchley published this massive catalog of mortality, what was the critical consensus?
The reception was largely positive. Critics praised the book for its dark wit, its accessibility, and its ability to take a subject that most people find unbearably morbid and make it genuinely engaging, even life-affirming.
But there were significant critiques as well. We already mentioned his somewhat biased dismissal of the analytic philosophers.
Yes. Furthermore, some critics pointed out that Critchley's constant reliance on humor and irony, while making the book a highly entertaining read, sometimes functions as a defense mechanism. By focusing on the absurdity of a philosopher choking on an apricot or being baked in cow dung, he sometimes deflects from the true, heavy emotional devastation of human loss.
He keeps the tragedy at arm's length with a joke. And there is also the undeniable issue of representation. The history of philosophy has undeniably been a bit of a boys' club, and the book reflects that.
Critchley attempts to rectify this by including the deaths of brilliant women throughout history. He includes Hipparchia, the Cynic philosopher, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who fiercely challenged Descartes on the flaws in his mind-body dualism, and 20th century giants like Simone de Beauvoir and Hannah Arendt. But critics rightfully noted that female thinkers are still heavily marginalized in the text compared to the sheer volume of men.
We should also note how the book handles highly polarizing political figures. Critchley includes Karl Marx, whose famous epitaph demands that philosophers shouldn't just interpret the world, but actively change it. He also includes Giovanni Gentile, the intellectual architect of Italian fascism, who was assassinated by anti-fascist partisans. It's fascinating to strip away all the massive political baggage of a figure like Marx or Gentile and just look at the terrified, fragile human animal at the end of their lives. We are looking at the biological reality of their deaths, tracing the ideas as they appear in the source material without endorsing their vast ideological impacts.
Exactly. The doxographical lens levels the playing field. Whether you are a saint, a fascist, a logician, or a mystic, biology eventually claims you. Which brings us finally to the core thesis of Critchley's entire massive project. After sifting through the deaths of nearly 200 of the greatest minds in human history, what is his ultimate prescription for our modern anxiety?
He calls it embracing our creatureliness.
Creatureliness. It is a profoundly grounding concept. To recognize yourself as a creature is to fundamentally accept your absolute dependence, your physical vulnerability, and your lack of omnipotence.
It is the deeply humbling acceptance that we are not gods. We cannot code our way out of biology. We are flesh and blood, subject to disease, subject to accidents, and inevitably subject to an ending. But the brilliance of Critchley's argument is that this realization isn't supposed to trigger a depressive spiral, is it?
No, it's the exact opposite. Critchley argues that it is our desperate fantasy of immortality, our delusion that we can conquer death, or biohack our way to eternity, or hoard enough wealth to build a fortress against disease. That is the actual source of our deepest neuroses. That delusion requires constant, exhausting maintenance. It leads to aggressive conflicts, greed, and a pervasive low-level terror that the fortress will eventually crack.
Because deep down we know the fortress is made of sand.
Precisely. By giving up that exhausting fantasy, by taking a deep breath and accepting our creatureliness, we find the only true foundation for courage. If you stop mortgaging your present happiness to work about the eternity after you die, you are finally mentally free to find intense, unburdened joy in the reality of the present moment.
So, to synthesize our deep dive today, from Socrates confidently drinking the hemlock, to Pythagoras dying for a bean, to Diderot stubbornly choking on an apricot, the history of philosophy isn't just a series of abstract academic exercises confined to dusty libraries. It is a high-stakes rehearsal for our final exit.
And by studying how these incredible minds succeeded, and often hilariously failed, to face the end, we learn that dodging our mortality is a fool's errand. Embracing our finite, fragile nature, our creatureliness, is the key to focusing on the now, rather than being paralyzed by the terror of the later.
It is a powerful framework for living. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over, one that challenges even Critchley's tidy conclusion.
This raises an important question, brought into focus by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Derrida was one of the most brilliant, complex minds of the late 20th century, the master of deconstructing texts to reveal their hidden contradictions. But on his deathbed, suffering agonizingly from pancreatic cancer, Derrida made a stunningly vulnerable confession. He admitted that despite a lifetime of rigorous philosophical inquiry, despite writing brilliantly on the concept of mortality, he remained utterly uneducatable about death. He confessed that he never made his peace with it. The terror of annihilation remained absolute.
The ultimate philosopher of deconstruction couldn't deconstruct his own fear. He admitted that learning how to die was a curriculum he simply couldn't master. And if we pair that failure with the thought of Hannah Arendt, we get a totally different perspective on life. Arendt argued that traditional philosophy spends entirely too much time obsessing over mortality over the exit door. She said we almost completely ignore the concept of natality.
Natality, the philosophy of birth. Arendt argues that our defining human characteristic isn't our capacity to die, but our unique, miraculous capacity to make new beginnings, to introduce something entirely unprecedented into the world through action and creation.
She flips the Socratic script entirely. So we leave you with this to ponder. Is the ultimate goal of your life really to make peace with the end, endlessly practicing for death like the ancients taught? Or is it okay to remain a little rebellious like Derrida, refusing to accept the void and focusing your energy instead like Arendt on the endless explosive possibilities of new beginnings every single day?
It is the beautiful, irresolvable tension between the final period at the end of the story and the blank page waiting for you tomorrow.
What a place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us on this profound deep dive into the messy, hilarious, and heartbreaking limits of human life. It has been a truly fascinating journey, and we'll see you next time as we dive into another stack of sources.